From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern.
The House Financial Services Committee gets its turn. 3 top regulators testifying on Capitol Hill for a second day as the FDIC now weighs whether to have big banks help plug the $23 billion hole from the SVB and Signature Bank failures.
For me, it's more a question of, how a failure that was both recognized by the regulators, they had been sort of barking at Silicon Valley Bank for a long time, how it was allowed to fester for almost half a year.
The key questions is how did the regulators miss the inflationary environment that we're in?
The stalemate between House Republicans and President Biden over the debt ceiling continues, but one place the GOP is moving with: investigations. We'll talk with Chair of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer.
Taiwan's president is expected to meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy next week as Beijing rattles sabers over the controversial trip, but the White House has words of caution.
The People's Republic of China should not use this transit as a pretext to step up any aggressive activity around the Taiwan Strait.
We'll discuss the issues at play with former U.S. Army General Mark Kimmitt straight ahead this hour.
Yeah, so much coming up this week and next week. Today, though, obviously, the banks once again front and center.
Yeah.
I love this line from Patrick McHenry. We need competent financial supervisors, but Congress can't legislate competence.
Yeah, how about that? And boy, it was a really interesting take. He was pretty aggressive with Michael Barr, who must not be having a very fun week, and really going through the timeline about who knew what when as they build the case the regulators failed to do their jobs.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to get more on this right now. Insight from our experts, Bloomberg's Mario Parker and Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins. Peggy, let's start with you. What did we learn today that you think is different than from the Senate hearing?
Well, I think a lot of it was repetitive. It did get a little bit more specific in terms of the Fed acknowledging that there were some oversight lapses. But I think certainly, as Michael Barr did again today in terms of the testimony, just really try to answer people's questions about what did the Fed know when and did they act fast enough? I think the other questions that are coming into play is what may need to change in terms of the thresholds for banks and how they are regulated at the Fed and at the regional level.
There are a lot of questions, Mario, about whether there's a legislative solution, whether there's a path for one, or whether regulators need to act on their own. Do these hearings give us a sense of what that answer might be?
It looks like a lot of the culpability will be on the regulators, right? You're saying some of that rhetoric from both the White House and then on the Hill, where the White House is essentially pointing, there's some finger pointing going on, and the White House is acknowledging the fact that, well, the votes probably aren't there for some wide spread overhaul.
There is one place I find it so interesting that there's potential bipartisanship, and this is raising the FDIC cap. Yeah. And before the hearing, lawmakers were asked about this, their thoughts on should they not raise that insurance cap. Take a listen.
It's worth talking about whether 250,000 is the right number or not, but the ideas that are circulating around, lifting the cap entirely, I think would create a huge amount of risk in the system, a huge amount of moral hazard.
I don't know that that's really what the driver is of the underlying problem. The real underlying problem, as I see it, is the fact that we're in persistently high inflation.
Peggy, Bloomberg actually broke some news on this FDIC cap.
That's right. Essentially, we broke the scoop earlier today, essentially that they are looking at ways to pay for this, right? So, Mario knows better than anyone. The Biden administration has been very careful about threading the needle between trying to make sure people feel safe about their money in banks and not looking like they're bailing out the banks. So one of the things would be, well, who pays for this if we insure lots more of people's money at a higher threshold through the FDIC? And one of the things our journalists are pointing to is whether or not the big banks would actually get assessed a certain fee in order to pay for that.
Mario, we spoke with Brendan Boyle about this. Congressman was the one lawmaker we've talked to who dared put a number on it. What should it be? 500,000? He said, how about we start the conversation at $1 million? What would it take to cover that, to pay for it?
Yeah, well, I guess the politics of that, if you look at it, $1 million, a lot of Americans don't know. They can't conceive of that number, right?
Yeah.
But the fact is, and you see this to Peggy's point at the Biden administration's speaking about savings, is that people want certainty that their hard-earned money will be in the bank, right? So if the number is $1 million, if it's $250, if it's $500,000, the signal it sends to the populace is that, hey, we're not going to bail out bankers at your expense.
Yeah, right.
Do you think any of this, though, this FDIC debate resonates with potential voters ahead of 2024? Or is this just like a Bloomberg conversation debate we like to have with lawmakers?
No, not at all. I think it does. And you're seeing right now with the Biden administration and then what we're seeing with the Republican Party is this populist strain that's going through the electorate right now, right? Again, to that point about not having an appetite to bail out just the rich or just the Wall Street, but to make sure that everybody's okay, right? That message is sent to Iowa or Ohio or Pennsylvania or Georgia, right? It does have some resonance.
So reality check time, Peggy, I'll ask you for one. Fed's not going to be out with its report till the 1st of May, right? It's internal review. If another bank doesn't fail, and by the way, they're about to go on recess. We're now in the second half of the year. Do you actually see any world in which there's a concerted effort to pass legislation to deal with any tightening of regulations? And I ask you that as well after Michael Barr today said basically openly in this committee hearing that the changes made to Dodd-Frank in 2018 had nothing to do with this.
Well, I do think there's a high probability that something gets changed because of how the speed with which it happens, right? Silicon Valley Bank, not on the radar of anybody on a Wednesday, goes down on a Friday. Yeah. Essentially, that's what happened. So I think someone's going to feel like we have to do something so that we can assure, as Mario is saying, people that people's money is safe. I think the question is there another event soon that makes this even worse? And I think we're focusing a lot on what happened in Washington, what led to this, but investors are focusing right now on who could be next or what else could crack next. And so we may be behind in Washington of the next event.
And to Joe's point, I think adding on more regulation that they rolled back in 2018, while the Democrats obviously want to talk about it, 17 of them in the Senate, 33 of them in the House actually voted to roll it back. So how can they even take that message on the campaign trail in 2024?
Well, I mean, to your point, Anne-Marie, I do think it's possible that there are some on the margin changes, right? The Fed may be under fire to change how it regulates banks in the little space, in the medium space, which is under a lot of heat, and then the biggest banks. So you may see numbers change there. We're talking a lot about FDIC insurance threshold, but the Fed has different thresholds for how it manages different types of banks.
Controls, liquidity.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to get into the race, the fun stuff here with our panel, because we're always ready to talk about 2024, especially when Peggy and Mario walk in the room. New numbers today, Quinnipiac University, Trump 47, DeSantis 33. That's the landscape now?
That is the landscape if we're looking at the primary, right?
Yes.
But if you blow that big picture up, what you see is that in the general election, Biden actually wins against Trump. That's right. But it loses against DeSantis.
So take those one at a time. Donald Trump's the nominee. Joe Biden remains the president. If DeSantis can pull this off, he does not.
And that's why you hear so many talking points from the White House about MAGA Republicans, right? They're licking their chops at the prospect of a rematch, Trump-Biden Part 2. But DeSantis is the one that gives them a little bit of pause, you're saying. And that's the conundrum that the electorate, the GOP electorate, has in front of them. Is it a popularity contest where Trump wins 30% of the vote and skates back into a rematch, but probably loses to Biden? Or is DeSantis able to convince primary voters to look at that big picture that I mentioned again, that, hey, I may not be as popular as Trump with you all. You may not be buying DeSantis gear and hats, but I'm the one that's best suited to beat Biden in the general election.
But, Joe, this reminds me of what Governor Sununu said to us when we were on Balance of Power. He said it's not about stepping in. It's about when these other candidates decide to step out. At what point do they all start rallying behind DeSantis?
You're saying some of the folks that relived it or that lived this in 2016, right? So you're saying Ted Cruz, who we widely expected a year ago to be running for president. He didn't. I think there's some glimpses there when you look at DeSantis' team. A lot of them are Cruz campaign veterans. So you're saying a bit of an autopsy of 2016, where the party went wrong. But again, it's that fight between that 30% that's steadfast and resolute with former President Donald Trump, and then those other Republicans who have been agitating for change for the last 7 years, and whether or not they went out this time.
Great analysis. Mario Parker, many thanks as well, along with Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins, talking to us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we're joined by Representative James Comer of Kentucky. An important conversation about oversight next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Investigations into the House have been ramping up since Republicans took control this year. There are so many, we can't count them all at this point. And joining us today is the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, the man running these investigations. That would be Republican Congressman James Comer of Kentucky. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for being with us here on Balance of Power. There are so many various places I could begin, but I'll start with news of the day, as we say. You and two other Republican House committee chairs have requested testimony and, in fact, investigative materials from the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg. You want him to come to Washington and talk about his investigation into the former President Donald Trump and allegations he paid hush money to Stormy Daniels. They've responded. They say no, and in fact said it's an unlawful incursion into New York sovereignty. Mr. Chairman, will you subpoena Alvin Bragg?
Well, that's a decision that we're going to have to discuss. In the end, Jim Jordan, who's chairman of the Judiciary Committee, will make that final decision. He's in charge of the judiciary. I'm in charge of taxpayer dollars. And, you know, when you look at it from my standpoint, this is a clear waste of money. We had a hearing today with the leadership in Washington, D.C., and it was about crime. We've already passed one bill that President Biden actually signed into law to rescind some of the excessive criminal justice reform actions that the D.C. City Council has passed. Crime is a major issue for Republicans. We have a crime outbreak in America, and we believe that the Manhattan DA should be focused on his primary responsibility, and that's to prosecute criminals. Now, what we have here with the DA is he's prosecuting a presidential candidate for a federal election crime where the statute of limitations expired years ago. So there's many, many reasons why this has no business being litigated in local court in New York. So we have some questions for the DA. He does not have the luxury to turn us down. He will have to answer our questions one way or the other.
Congressman, here's what the American people think, according to a recent Economist YouGov poll, and that's that overwhelmingly, some 75% think it's a crime for a candidate to fail to report spending campaign money on payments to keep someone silent about an issue that may affect an outcome of an election. But then when they change it to the former president's name, do you think that Donald Trump should face criminal charges for these kind of things? It actually falls to 46%. Should a presidential candidate be paying money to silence a porn star ahead of an election?
Well, the president used personal funds, not campaign funds, and that's a big difference. Any court of law would know that. You can't use, let's say you're a candidate for any office and you get a divorce, and you know settling that divorce and signing some kind of agreement that would keep your spouse quiet, that would help your campaign, obviously. But you don't spend that, you don't pay for that divorce and that settlement with campaign funds. You pay personal funds. And that's what the president did. He used personal funds. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm saying this. It has no business being litigated in the local court. This is a federal campaign finance issue. So he's way out of his jurisdiction. And look, we just want government agencies and bureaucrats to stay out of presidential elections. The Democrats complained about James Comey leaking those emails against Hillary Clinton, and I agree with them. That was inappropriate and shouldn't have happened. We think there's been a lot of election interference in 2020 by different agencies and you know by special prosecutors and things like that. Let's just have free and fair elections and let the voters decide.
It just strikes me, Congressman, that we're talking about this as a point of fact that it actually happened. Is that where we are in Washington? Is it a fact that Donald Trump paid off a porn star?
The president, as you know, denies it. It's not my decision to determine whether or not he's telling the truth, but I can tell you this. He used personal campaign funds if, in fact, what Mr. Bragg is saying did happen, and the porn star was paid. They were paid with personal funds, and that's a big difference. If you're talking about trying to indict a presidential candidate, not to mention the former president of the United States, in a local district court, then the whole basis where you're claiming he's using campaign funds, he didn't. He used personal funds. Assuming he did it. Let's assume he's guilty, because most of the media always assumes Trump's guilty. Let's say he is guilty. He used personal funds. And again, the DOJ passed on this years ago. The statute of limitations has expired. It's a campaign finance law. Now, what Bragg said is when he said he wasn't coming to Congress to talk to Mr. Jordan or myself, he said that we didn't have any business in local court. He doesn't have any business litigating federal campaign finance laws. Those laws are written in Congress. So if anyone should be litigating that, it should be the Department of Justice, some U.S. attorney somewhere. If you start letting local attorneys investigate partisan issues that pertain to federal election laws, then what's going to happen is in my congressional district, you're going to start having Republican county attorneys start prosecuting the Biden family for different things. We've got a court. We've got a very defined court system in America, and I think for the most part it works. A local DA has no business having a trial and trying to indict a presidential candidate over a campaign finance violation that occurred over 5 years ago.
Congressman, you mentioned the Biden administration, the Biden family. You know, we're curious, where are you with the investigation? When do you plan on holding these next hearings?
Well, I think we're making a lot of progress. As you know, and hopefully Bloomberg reported, we produced bank records from the first bank that I subpoenaed, Bank of America, that showed there were the Biden family, between 3 and 4 members of the family, received over $1 million from a company directly linked to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that's, we feel like, reason to continue the investigation. That is one of what I believe are at least 10 different items, transactions that will show that the president's immediate family was receiving funds from the Chinese Communist Party. So this is very concerning. We're having people come in as we speak to talk to us. We're interviewing people, and I think you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of explaining to have to do on behalf of the president. We believe that the reason the family was receiving this money is because of favors that Joe Biden did either as vice president and or as president. So this is of the utmost concern for our national security.
That first hearing that we covered focused on Twitter's handling of this whole story, Mr. Chairman. What will the next hearing focus on, and will you subpoena Hunter Biden?
Well, right now we're bringing in people that were partners with Hunter Biden, and they're telling us about what the scheme was. And the media and the Biden attorneys, they say, well, these were legitimate business operations. Now, let me ask you this question. And Bloomberg's a pretty good business channel. What business exactly did the Bidens have? Because I've been looking through their financial records, and I've yet to find legitimate business. Just because you form an LLC and call it XYZ Energy Company, that doesn't mean you're in the energy business. So, we don't understand why the family received millions and millions of dollars from the Chinese Communist Party. We want to know why. And I think that's a legitimate question that every American should have. And at the end of the day, then we'll publish a report. And from a legislative standpoint, because this has legislative purpose, we're going to change the rules about influence peddling. The Democrats complained about influence peddling in the Trump administration. Republicans are complaining about influence peddling in the Biden administration. At the end of the day, we need to define what influence peddling is. We need to change our ethics laws, increase our disclosure laws, and prohibit China from coming in and buying influence from family members of high-ranking government officials.
Chairman, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. James Comer of Kentucky. Joe, my big takeaway there was the Republicans are having a hard time. Obviously, they don't like the legality of this case, but they're a hard time really going out against saying, well, we are against, though, presidential candidates from the Republican side paying hush money to a porn star. And the chairman there, right there, tried to change words. He said if you had a divorce.
Yes,
this isn't a divorce.
It's not a divorce. You'd think that type of thing would lead to one, but that's a whole different story, Anne-Marie. Interesting, though, he's alluding to legislation that might come from these hearings, something I haven't heard a lot about until now.
That's what we're waiting to see, more of that. Where's the action? All right, coming up in the program, higher capital rules may be looming for small regional banks after the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. What does it actually look like? That coming up next. This is Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Lawmakers are eyeing new policies around capital and liquidity standards in the wake of SVB's collapse. Joining us now to discuss this is Bloomberg's intelligence senior government analyst, Nathan Dean. Nathan, welcome. Thank you so much. I know you've been looking heavily into this. What kind of capital controls, liquidity, what can we see actually change?
So there's a couple of things that they can do, and the Fed has the power to push new capital requirements for banks that are $100 billion in assets. So the first thing that they're going to do is essentially put them in the same regime as banks that are $250 billion and up, so like PNC, Truist, and U.S. Bank. And these are banks like Huntington Bancorp, KeyCorp, Fifth Third, for example. But in terms of like the liquidity coverage ratios and so forth like that, it's going to be more of like a reduced daily test. Currently, they have to do like a quarterly test. So long story short is there's a lot more scrutiny coming for these regional lenders. And 2 years, 3 years ago, they sort of got out of it. Now they're going to go back into it again. We
had a great talk on Bloomberg Radio about day one. How is the sequel compared to the original movie for you? Did it move the needle on your odds that you're running on any potential legislation to come out of this?
No. So yesterday I called it a working hearing, and today was actually a working hearing. I was surprised. I thought it was going to be more partisan.
Same.
And we certainly had some of that, but the needle is certainly not going to move in terms of the congressional aspect. I mean, we're thinking 40% chance of legislation moving forward this year. 40. It's just there's no bipartisan agreement on what to do. And because the regulators have the ability to do it on their own, it's not like legislation's even needed. And in fact, in a couple of days, we're anticipating President Biden to come out with an executive order directing regulators to do this. So it's almost pretty much in the cards. It's going to be a regulatory solution.
It's important.
Yeah, certainly.
Bloomberg Intelligence senior government analyst Nathan Dean. You can find him on the terminal and the BI matrix with odds on whether these will ever see the light of day. Coming up, the Senate voting to repeal Iraq war authorizations 20 years after the U.S. invasion. Joining us to discuss, former Assistant Secretary of State Mark Kimmitt, the general, up next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. The Senate today repealed the Iraq War Authorization, the AUMF as we call it, 20 years after the U.S. invasion. Joining us, former Assistant Secretary of State Mark Kimmitt, retired U.S. Army General. It's great to see you, sir. You, of course, served in combat in Iraq 20 years after the fact. There was a concerted debate here. Was this the right move?
Well, first of all, we've got to understand it was two Iraq resolutions, both the AUMF from 1991 and the AUMF from 2002 as well. A lot of people would say it outlived its usefulness. There is some politics involved in this, but I think the major concern of the United States Congress is twofold. Number one, they rightfully have the responsibility for continuing war operations. And number two, there's an undertone of a concern that the United States might use the 2001 resolution in particular as an opportunity for the president to unilaterally declare operations against Iran.
So many people in Congress, or some are saying that this should not be overturned because they might need it, so should have it on the books. Yep. What do you make of that argument?
There's some validity to that, but I think the proponents of repealing it are saying that the president has enough authority under Article 2 that this is redundant.
Isn't there also a separate authorization from just after 9/11 the so-called war on terror authorization that would really cover the president in just about any instance. I heard Iran mentioned almost as many times as Iraq in this debate.
Yep.
Is that where your eyes are on this?
Well, 2001 is the AUMF against terrorism. That allows us to go after ISIL, allows us to go after al-Qaeda. And, of course, that's the authorization that's being used to attack ISIS and support forces in northern Syria. You, as well as I know, both of us, all of us, understand that lawyers can twist this any way they want. I remain convinced that the president does have enough authority to declare war, and Congress has enough authority after this vote to maintain war operations.
We are talking about Iran, so I do want to ask you, because we obviously had that strike in Syria. We have a plan A from this administration, which is a nuclear deal, which clearly is not going to happen. It is obviously pointing to a much more escalatory tone when it comes to Washington and Tehran. What is the plan B?
Well, first of all, I don't think plan A is completely over. I think Rob Malley is trying his best to get the Iranians back to the table.
How? With these women's in the streets?
I don't disagree, but in many cases, diplomacy is hope over reality. But in the case of going against the Iranian-backed proxies, that's been a problem for many, many years, and not just in Syria. They talk about the Shia crescent going from Iran to the Mediterranean. It's really a Shia encirclement to that region, because it goes northern Iraq, it goes northern Syria, into Lebanon, into Yemen, over into the eastern provinces, into Bahrain. So these proxies remain a major concern of all the countries in the region, not just the United States.
I want to ask you about the situation involving China by way of Taiwan. Taiwan's president is visiting the United States, and this is obviously upsetting some folks in Beijing. I'd love to hear from the spokesperson on this, if we can get to this in a news conference earlier today. I guess we'll hear from spokesperson John Kirby first, addressing China's warning to Taiwan not to meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy next week.
The People's Republic of China should not use this transit as a pretext to step up any aggressive activity around the Taiwan Strait. The United States and China have differences when it comes to Taiwan, but we have managed those differences for more than 40 years.
I think you were in the camp that said, yeah, Kevin McCarthy, make a bipartisan visit, take a Codell to Taiwan to make a point. Do you still feel that way after this conversation?
Yeah, I certainly do. Nancy Pelosi did the same thing as well. In both cases, it's sticking a thumb in the eyes of the Chinese. But at the time when China is becoming more and more provocative, we're taking steps as a country and as an alliance with the new AUKUS treaty to ensure that China understands that just because the United States is focused elsewhere and they're watching what Russia is doing in Ukraine, they should not use that opportunistically to try to get over to Taiwan to take over.
But we saw the provocations that came with that trip. And even many in Taiwan thought, this is going too far. We do not want to poke China. We're the ones that are going to have the repercussions when it comes to sanctions on Taiwan in terms of military drills in the Taiwan Strait. Is this timing-wise? Does this make sense?
Well, it really needs to be a sovereign decision of Taiwan whether we have those visits or not. And clearly, that is the decision that they want us to take.
So Speaker McCarthy in California makes sense with Tsai Ing-wen?
Personally, I'd rather see him do that in Taipei.
Maybe he'll have the chance to do both in the next few months. Does he follow this up with a visit?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I want to also shift gears to obviously what's going on with Russia. Vladimir Putin was recently on Russia State TV giving an interview talking about moving of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. Now, him and Lukashenko have talked about this in the past, but it does seem that he is actually going to deliver on this discussion. How concerned does that make you?
My view is that Vladimir Putin is not one on the ground. He's tried to win by attacking the cities inside of Ukraine to try to terrorize the people. That's not working. His cyber threats have certainly not been working. So my view is that he's not winning on the ground, he's not winning in the air, he's not winning in cyberspace, so now he's going to try to have a media war. I don't think he will be any more successful as he tries to intimidate the world in general and NATO in particular, and especially Ukraine, in his nuclear saber rattling.
All right, former Assistant Secretary of State Mark Kimmitt, thank you so much for your time. Really a lot to talk about there. Coming up on the program, a new poll shows President Biden topping the former President Trump in 2024, but he fails with Ron DeSantis. We'll wrap up the details with our political panel. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power.
I'm John Hyland, and this is the Bloomberg First Word News. Turkey's parliament will vote to approve Finland's membership in NATO on Thursday, following through on President Recep Erdogan's promise to let the Nordic nation into the defense alliance. The ratification will lift the last obstacle to Finland's entry into NATO after Hungary's parliament gave the green light on Monday. The timeline on Sweden's bid for membership is still unclear. Pope Francis will spend the next few days in the hospital undergoing treatment for a lung infection. The Vatican says the 86-year-old went to the hospital for tests after experiencing difficulty breathing in recent days. The news is raising questions about Francis' overall health and his ability to celebrate the busy Holy Week events that are due to begin this weekend with Palm Sunday. The Vatican says Francis does not have COVID. North Korea is indicating it has no intention of abandoning its nuclear weapons ambitions. Kim Jong-un's regime released photos this week of Kim inspecting warheads designed for missiles to strike U.S. allies in Asia and to deliver a nuclear bomb to the American mainland. Weapons experts say the images indicate Pyongyang has made progress in miniaturizing its warheads, which increases its ability to deliver a nuclear strike. And a major tool in the fight against the opioid crisis is about to get easier access. The Food and Drug Administration has approved overdose reversal drug Narcan for over-the-counter sales. That means Narcan could be available in grocery and convenience stores, vending machines, and even online by late summer. Demand for the product has risen as officials across the country look for ways to prevent overdose deaths. Global news, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. President Biden would defeat Trump if the 2024 presidential election was held today, but Biden would lose to Governor DeSantis. And this is according to a poll released just today. Let's bring in our panel, see what they make of it. Jim Kessler, Executive Vice President for Policy at Third Way, and Lisa Camusa-Miller, Partner at Reset Public Affairs and former RNC Communications Director. For more 2024 insight, we have a perfect table. Mm-hmm. Lisa, let's start with you. What do you make of this poll? It basically means that Biden, if we see Trump starting to fail, the Democrats may need to think about a number two that could maybe come in.
How is the poll, based on what I saw today, it strikes me that the folks that were surveyed are looking for something new and fresh. They're looking for a new voice. And right now, that's represented by Governor DeSantis. Whether or not he is the candidate that we ultimately nominate for 24 is yet to be seen. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions about how battle-tested and ready he is for the ballot. So I think that there's a lot more to see here. But if you put Trump against Biden, I think the question still comes down to folks are looking for someone new. They're looking for something fresh and less exciting than maybe the former president.
Jim, this is a Quinnipiac poll. We've got Trump 47, DeSantis 33. That's exactly what the former president wants to see here. This is also exactly what President Biden wants to see because he beats Trump here by 2 points. He loses to Ron DeSantis by 2, though. Inside that campaign apparatus, assuming there's going to be one, we know he wants to run against Donald Trump. But how does he position himself to potentially run against Ron DeSantis?
Well, first of all, I just remember that Donald Trump won the Republican primary with 45% of the vote and got 62% of the delegates. I think Donald Trump is the presumptive nominee at this point. And I'm not very bullish on Ron DeSantis. He's got a real problem, which is Joe Biden's going to go after him, Donald Trump's going to go after him, and the 11 Republican candidates underneath Ron DeSantis are going to go after him. So I think there is a long time in this campaign for Ron DeSantis to be the heir apparent. I would not give him the nod just yet. Yeah.
So we also should make the point that Ron DeSantis has yet to announce that he is going to be running for president. But with that put aside, when you look at the Democratic Party and how they are gearing up for this, if you do think it is going to be the former president, all of this talk of an indictment in New York, the 3 other investigations, that just helps Biden's case, doesn't it?
It helps Biden's case. I think it helps Trump's case in a Republican primary, too, because what we're seeing right now is potential Republican presidential candidates not handling that issue well. What they need to be saying is, look, maybe there's some overreach there, but let's face it, paying a porn star, hush money, laws were probably broken, he can't be our nominee. Like, you got to hit him hard. You got to hit Trump hard or lose.
I really haven't heard anyone say that.
No, that's correct. As we look further down in this poll, Pence, Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Glenn Youngkin, Chris Sununu, Chris Christie, most of them haven't announced yet, with the exception of Nikki Haley. They're all in single digits. So when you step back and kind of squint your eyes and imagine that debate stage, you're obviously expecting some we haven't named yet.
Well, I hope so, but I'm not sure that there will be. And
to your point earlier, in a few months, though.
No question about it. I also think, though, we are applying an old model to a new set of rules. So what ordinarily would have been a disqualifier for a presidential candidate is no longer one. It's still part of the conversation. We've been talking about these allegations against the former president for months, years. There was a resurrection, or an insurrection against the Capitol. There's so much on the side of Donald Trump, but his supporters are so loyal to him that regardless of what he has done, he continues to be their candidate of choice, and all of this other investigation is working in his favor because he's speaking to it and he's calling himself out as someone that is being targeted and attacked, and his supporters are supporting him in spite of all of that.
What do you make of Chris Christie saying, "I will never support the former president"?
Well, it's a little too late, he is my former governor. But Chris Christie, to your point earlier, he is the one and only candidate in that candidate pool of less than 1% that actually spoke up to say that. But who really believes that? None of the commentary I saw today was complimenting him for what he had said. In fact, if anything, their comments were, this is just too little, and nobody believes it because he was with him first.
Brian McDaniel, though, wants the candidates to take that pledge before they get on the debate stage.
Yeah, 100%.
He's not going to do it.
No.
So the precedent's now been set.
Yes.
It's an important development.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, we'll be back with our panel. We've got a lot more to talk about with Lisa Cabuso-Miller and Jim Kessler. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Anne-Marie Hordern. Fascinating conversation a little earlier with the chair of the Oversight Committee. This is Jim Comer. This is Hunter Biden's laptop, the same man who wants to, it sounded to me like, subpoena the DA from Manhattan.
They will discuss a possible subpoena.
Yeah,
that could be happening.
Let's see if that really takes place. But, of course, Alvin Bragg has no plans to come to Washington.
No, absolutely not. But I think what's also interesting is it's very difficult for Republicans to talk about this case because it's easy for them to say, this is a Manhattan DA, this is a political witch hunt. Right. But when you ask them point blank about hush money to a porn star, it is difficult for them. They cannot give you a yes or no answer if a presidential candidate should be doing that. Yeah, Donald Trump says that this never happened, of course. This is alleged. But they will not even give you an answer of whether or not this is the norm now.
Well, he said
US
alleged
politics.
after we asked him about it. He was speaking point of fact, saying that the former president used personal funds to pay Stormy Daniels. So what's alleged here? You want to hear from Jim Comer before we reassemble the panel on the idea of what this DA from Manhattan is doing wrong and why Congress would talk to him. Listen.
There's many, many reasons why this has no business being litigated in local court in New York. So we have some questions for the DA. He does not have the luxury to turn us down. He will have to answer our questions one way or the other.
All right, we'll see about that as we reassemble our panel. As I mentioned, Jim Kessler's here, Executive Vice President for Policy at Third Way, and Lisa Cabuso-Miller, partner at Reset Public Affairs, former RNC Communications Director. Talk to us about Jim Comer here, Lisa. He's on a bit of a crusade. We talked about a lot of different cases. We did get to the Hunter Biden story and whether he will end up subpoenaing the president's son. Are any of these investigations, though, and we can talk about the Trump case specifically if you want, going to lead to legislation or some sort of conclusive outcome?
No, I think these are reactions and responses to the way that the former president has assembled his supporters. They believe that the federal government and that the Democrats are out to get them. They fully believe that. 30% of the people that still stand behind Donald Trump seem to believe that, and they are galvanized. I mean, they were in Waco, Texas just this past weekend to support him. So I think that this is the Hill's reaction, the House GOP's reaction to that support, and they're doing everything they can to try to speak to that audience so that they can then have a successful 2024 and put a Republican back in the White House.
But what do they run on? Just we ran all these hearings? Like, to Joe's point, if there's no legislation, what is it? We subpoenaed a lot of people. That's it? We had a lot of hearings?
Well, I think, though, that if you look at H.R. 1, for instance, is a bill that's on the floor this week, and they're talking about energy and energy independence and a variety of other issues that are involved in the bill. There is bipartisan support for that legislation. The Republicans are leading on that issue and believe that they'll continue to do the same. They'll do that again with debt ceiling, they believe. These are the kinds of words that we're hearing off of Capitol Hill right now. So they are trying to demonstrate that they can govern. It is a split government, though. The Senate still controls the Democrats still control the Senate and the White House.
For the Democrat view on this, Jim, references to Benghazi are frequent because they see this as a road to nowhere. How do you run against this?
Well, look, I think the House is not going to pass that much legislation because it's a split Congress, so they need to fill their time doing something, and these investigations are doing it. I don't see this as Benghazi. I just don't see the interest there. Hunter Biden is not Hillary Clinton. It's a different ballgame. And I think, looking at what's happening with the Manhattan DA, this is a very awkward conversation for the Republican Party, because you can say, okay, maybe there's some overreach there. And of the 4 cases against Trump, this is probably the weakest, but it's also the one about sex and about a porn star and about hush money and about the National Enquirer and media killing stories. It's kind of irresistible. So I think on this one, maybe advantage Democrats.
Right. What I found fascinating was this recent Economist YouGov poll, which overwhelmingly people feel that a presidential candidate this is a crime, should not be, with this alleged crime, should not be giving hush money to a porn star. But then you put Donald Trump's name in, and you see those responses go much lower. Obviously, it's almost like the rules are different for him.
Well, note to self, don't pay hush money to a porn star if I'm ever decided to run for president, although it seemed to work for Donald Trump. This is why it's an awkward situation for Republicans. But, it's the point that Lisa made. This gins up his supporters. And if you look at the Republican primary in 2024, Donald Trump won last time because there were 4 candidates in the race actively vying for votes and delegates through 30 states. And it's very possible that will be the case this time, and he'll win the nomination on this because of a crowded field, and his supporters feel he is the victim, not the criminal.
If we can get to a little more substance and policy, since both of you are here, we've had an incredible back and forth this week, not to disappoint anyone, on the debt ceiling. Dueling letters from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to another. Joe Biden says, hey, guys, let us know when you get a budget here, right? They keep asking the president to sit down. Kevin McCarthy wants to have a meeting. It looks like there will be another. But is that the strategy? You let Republicans pass a budget so you can then react to it. We're not going to talk until then.
That's the way Washington used to work.
Okay.
But I don't know. I think the rules are different. I've said it before today. I mean, I do think that Kevin McCarthy is playing a very different game than the White House is. And McCarthy, 15 ballots or however many there were, he's still the speaker, and he is actually stronger today than he was when that process first started. And we have a Senate, too, that is a little bit without leadership. So now, I think more than ever, Kevin McCarthy, I think he holds the keys to this card, and he will sit back and wait for the White House to answer his letter, of which there were several issues that both Democrats and Republicans can agree that there could be some compromise.
And Speaker McCarthy says that the budget is different than the debt ceiling. Just very quickly from both of you, who is to blame if there was to be financial calamity? Is it Speaker McCarthy or is it Biden?
It's Speaker McCarthy.
Okay, from the Democrat. Lisa?
think the president takes
the president. All right, there we go. It's a tie. I mean, I think at the end of the day, honestly, I think it'll be blowback on both of them.
Yeah, although in the past, it's who is in the majority on Capitol Hill. We'll find out this time.
All right, our thanks to Jim Kessler, Executive Vice President for Policy at Third Way, and Lisa Camusa Miller, Partner at Reset Public Affairs. More of these stories, of course, on our Balance of Power newsletter. That's all we have for today. Thanks for joining us.